Welcome to Primetime. I'm Susan Hoskins, your host. I'm the Executive Director of the Princeton Senior Resource Center. We're a nonprofit organization providing programs and services to older adults, their families, and caregivers. We seek to educate people about aging issues, and today my guest is Soni Pahade. You are with the Senior Wellbeing Program at the Greater Trenton Behavioral Health.
Yes.
And you do a lot of education around the Mercer County area on a variety of aging topics. And so we thought that today we would talk about how to have the conversation. So we hope that both older adults and family caregivers will listen and think about these issues, about how we have the conversations between parents and adult children on aging and what people's plans are. Sometimes I know that the young adults, the children, we'll call them, begin to notice things. Somebody's memory isn't so good, or the car's banged up, or some of those things. And sometimes people just feel that at a certain age you're supposed to do this. And sometimes it's the older adults who really want to talk with their children about their plans and decisions. But it's often a very difficult conversation to have. So Soni, I'm so happy that you've come to talk a little bit about that today.
Thank you, Susan. I do feel like this is a very important issue. I started giving this talk because I found as I was reading about how to negotiate between families that there's so much literature out there for children to talk to their parents, and there's really not a lot of information about how seniors can talk to their adult children.
And the important thing is to realize that the conversation can start on either end, isn't it?
Yes. And I think for both parties, sometimes, especially the older person, feels a little threatened when a child brings it up because they're afraid of losing some independence. But I keep encouraging seniors that when you talk about these issues, you're actually taking control of the matter.
That's really important. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a little advice booklet that came out that talked about a 40-70 rule, and that kind of indicated that when you're 40 and your parents are 70, it's time to have the talk, which made sense. But it was interesting because some people who come in to our programs who were on the older end of that were really, like you say, offended. And the way they read that, it was saying at 70 you can't do anything for yourself anymore, and it's time for your children to take over driving and bill paying and all of that. And my experience is that it's not so much about age, it's about abilities.
Yeah, and I think I know that since that reaction, and I know you also had some input in letting them know, but they have revamped it so there's a 40-70 talk and there's a 70-40 talk.
Yeah.
And after reviewing that, it was the only place I saw a website really taking some time to address that issue. So it starts with maybe a child noticing that a parent has to stop driving. But now it says, if your child approaches you about stopping driving, and all of the different scenarios that they discuss is really being aware of what your limitations are, being open to discussing it. Many of us don't think that there's ever going to be a time when we can't drive. And living out here, you're so limited and homebound if you can't drive. So nobody wants to think about being stuck at home.
Driving is independence for so many people.
Right. So what
so
they're
there
recommending.
isn't a magical age.
No.
But it's so important to begin to have the conversation. And I think, you talk about driving, and that is such a big hot button issue, but I think it's important to have that conversation even before those issues come up, isn't it?
Right, yeah, that's what I've been telling seniors, that if you really have to think about this. And when you start having the discussion, you're really showing that you have control over the situation because you've thought that far ahead, and that you tell your children, your children might say, I don't know if I'm supposed to take away your key, or what happens when I feel this way and you don't. So when you've already had that discussion, I'm not saying when the time comes it's going to be easier, but at least you'll have a starting place.
And you've begun to think about what kinds of options to put in place and what choices you have.
Right.
I think that what you're saying is so important in that because both of us try so hard to empower people to make informed decisions and to feel that they're in charge of decisions, that there's no magical age or even an ability point where a person can do nothing
Right.
anymore. And so I know that what both of us try to do is to find those things that a person still has ability to do. And I also know how important it is for families to have some sense of what a person wants before they reach the point where the person can't express themselves.
You're absolutely
And
right.
sometimes that happens very suddenly.
Right. And the literature actually shows that more than half of adult children do want to know these things, and they're afraid to bring it up. They don't want their parent to feel that they were being condescending. They often don't want to worry about it. They, my experience has been many seniors who I talk to about this say, you know what, I have thought about it. I know exactly what I want, and my children are not listening. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to hear it. And I think maybe a lot of you people watching will have that problem, which is the opposite, that their children just refuse to acknowledge that there are things that they're going to have to worry about. And some of the tips that you can use is to bring it up slowly. So maybe you don't want to have a big family intervention where everybody sits down and you make it a very heavy
Formal,
conversation.
right.
But you could do it on a drive. You could do it at lunch. You could do it over the holidays. I know they said don't spring bad news on a holiday, but this isn't bad news. This is you just having a conversation. And when everyone's feeling good, having time together, that's a great time to bring it up. And it might not be, your end-of-life wishes. You could just say, I'm putting my finances together. It's tax time. I'm getting my paperwork together. I made a list. Just wanted you to keep a copy of it. Maybe evolve that into a power of attorney conversation. Because sometimes the finances are an easier subject to broach than healthcare topics.
Right. We kind of started off on one of the tough ones with driving, but what we're really talking about when we talk about having the conversation isn't end of life. It's all of the little things that go into what are you planning for your next steps.
Right.
It might be, what would you do if one of you became mobility challenged? What would you do if, tough to talk about, but if one of you weren't here, would the other one stay in the house? What would
Exactly.
you do? Help me out here.
I think what you're talking about is aging in place, and that is another big concern. We have some examples here. We have a lot of new developments, adult living developments, which allow the master bedroom and all of the main facilities to be offered on the first floor, but that is not always an option. Some of us are very attached to our houses. I know I am. So taking the precautions to how can you outfit a bathroom in case something should happen? Do you have the tools to get up the stairs or make a makeshift bedroom downstairs? And those are things you can do before
Even
you
before
are ill.
there's a need, right? You don't have to wait until you're in a wheelchair or you have trouble lifting yourself before you put grab bars in the... You don't have to wait for a fall to happen before you
And
put
it's
grab
not
bars
always
in the shower.
expensive. I know there are lots of companies in Mercer County that can offer more affordable solutions. Now grab bars, they used to be in New York, you had to drill into the wall and the tile and it was messy and expensive, and now I think at Bed Bath & Beyond they have the suction grips that are really strong, and people use them on a stairwell. You have a handle on one side, but you need a little leverage on the other side. So,
And that's one of the things that family can observe when you come to visit. Where does your parent grab on, look for something? I was visiting one person, and when they got up off the toilet, they grabbed on the towel bar. When they got out of bed, they grabbed onto the window knob for the casement window, which were clearly unsafe. But then we knew exactly where to put the grab bars, too.
well, that person is really lucky we're there. Some people just don't think about it, and I had a client she was a lovely woman, had been independent her whole life in New York City in a building, and she had the life alert, which we all talk about, and you and I know that people have it, and they say, it's on my nightstand, in case I need it, and I say, well, how often are you laying in bed where you can reach your bed rest and reach it? I had a client, she didn't like to think about the fact that she needed a walker, and at night she would put it away, and she had to get out of bed, and she tripped over a floor rug. And she had to wait there until her companion came in the morning. And then she said, no, 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 I'm fine, I'm fine. And because she didn't want anyone to know that she had fallen, I knew. And then she called me the next day and said, I really think I do need to go to the hospital. She said, but I want you to come here because I don't want my neighbors to see me in my nightgown. So I want to get dressed. I want to put my hose on. I want to put my shoes on to leave because I've lived here forever and I don't want to be seen that way. And I was glad that at least she finally reached out for help. But all of that could have been avoided by her just having a few safety issues.
You're talking about the Lifeline or the Help I've Fallen button. There are lots of different models out there. And I think one of the things that sometimes happens again, and it's part of why we're encouraging people to have these conversations, is they wait too long. So I'm thinking of another family where the dementia had progressed so much that I knew that it wasn't in the person's awareness to push the button.
Right.
You know, if you can't pick up a phone and call 911, which is a well-ingrained memory, you're not going to know a new technology.
I think what they're recommending now is that you just have it by your doorway, and when you put your bag down or you put your cell phone down if you're using one, or you just walk in, you just put it on.
Right.
It'll be uncomfortable in the beginning, but if you can prevent a more serious injury, which then will lead to all of these conversations that we're discussing, whether you can remain at home, what your wishes are financially and healthcare-wise, you know, those small precautions
So
can
let
help.
me put a plug in here too for us, because I think that sometimes adult children know that they need to have the conversation, but they're not sure how to start it, and they're not sure what they need to talk about. And I think that's a time when you and I come into play. Come in and talk to us and say, I know I need to have this conversation, but what should I bring up? And we talk about what can your parent do and what can't they do, and what are the options, so that when you go to talk with your parent, you've got some resources to talk about.
And I think people would be surprised how many resources there really are in Mercer County. It is a very educated and well-funded county. And so if
our new directory arrives today.
Okay.
So by the time this airs, it will be available. And it's 150 pages now. And it's also on our website. So anybody can go into our website or the county website and look for links to services in the area.
And I think for children who want to have that talk, as a parent or as an older adult, if you can show them that you are aware of these resources, that's also another way to show that you aren't going to be blindsided by these issues, even though they're uncomfortable to talk about.
So we're talking about having the talk between adult parents and children about aging issues and what to plan for. And it's not just end-of-life issues. It's not what do you want to have happen. It's in fact about quality of life issues. It's about all of the different stages between here and that final exit.
That's right. If you are adamant that you want to remain at home, which many of us do, then show that, you know, I want to remain at home. This is what I'm going to do in the winter. This is how I plan to get around. If something happens to me, I'm willing to go to rehab, but I want to remain at home. How are you going to pay for some help if you need it at home? Do you have a long-term care insurance that can cover it?
So it's kind of scenario planning, isn't it? What if, you know, and but either parent or child saying, well, what if this happened, and what would I do, so that you have shared what some of those things are. Sometimes adult children have no idea that their parent is working with you or working with me. So it's sometimes just saying, you know, this is my social worker, or I have a private geriatric care manager, or I belong to Secure at Home, or whatever, that you can say to your kids, this is who I've been talking with this about. And sometimes it's easier to talk with somebody like that than your own family.
Definitely. And there's a book, The Complete Elder Care Planner. It's very easy to use. You can get it on Amazon. I know our Barnes & Nobles doesn't always carry it. And it will walk you through those documents that you need and different issues that the person helping you might need. But I don't think that's only what we're talking about. Somebody asked me today when I gave a talk earlier, what is a health proxy and how is it different than a living will? And as I was explaining it, I thought really what we're talking about is the same. You can have a power of attorney to deal with your finances, and you can have a health proxy to deal with your health issues. But there's a lot in the middle, like you said, that you need somebody who will understand what your wishes and goals are so they can help facilitate that.
And what I'm hearing in a lot of my caregiver support groups is not the end of life issues, but the quality of life issues. So it's things like, my husband has pretty advanced Alzheimer's. Should I take him for a colonoscopy? Well, maybe we don't need to do that. Or because getting him out of the house, going through a procedure, going through anesthesia, which can affect memory, all of those things are more difficult than, or, I'm going to a family wedding, what can I do with my care recipient? Should I take him? Should I leave him at home? What kinds of things? So there are a lot of those kinds of conversations that go on that aren't about end of life, but about where we are now, where we might be a few years from now, and a few years after that. And everybody has said how important it is to have those conversations early, because then if something suddenly happens like a stroke, you have some context to say, we didn't talk about what would we do if we had a stroke, because it can have all kinds of consequences, but I know how my parent feels about where they want to live, who they want to take care of them, or my spouse. It's not always a parent, it could be a neighbor. We've had those conversations. I have some ideas about what their choices would be, and that makes it so much easier to make decisions.
And another point of starting early is that somebody in the party might be resistant. We all know the people, they're a little bit defensive at first, but they're processing the information. So you will have a span of time to discuss it as they come around, whether it's the parent or the child, to explore it. And at the end of the day, you need to have complete faith in the person that's going to be helping you with these things. And it doesn't happen with the one day over lunch. You mention these things and then
you're not going to cover
done.
the entire planner in one lunch. So part of what you're suggesting is also doing it in little bits.
Yes. And sometimes I think that's by introducing different topics at different times. Because even if you try and have it all at once, you might veer off topic, you might be overwhelmed with a certain subject, and you might think of something later. You can keep some notes, and then maybe once a month it will be your goal to bring these up. You don't have to have an appointment every Friday at 9. We're going to talk about these issues. But if you just keep a running list, the idea is that hopefully somebody knows what you want enough that when these fuzzy issues come up, they can really support your decisions.
Well, I think in education, it's what we call teachable moments.
Yes.
And I have found, and I think that's what you're saying, is that you grab those moments. So I know that one of the ones that I grabbed recently, because I found it hard, I'm in this business, but it's still not, it's a lot easier to talk to somebody else's parents than my parents. But they were dealing with the death of a really close friend, and I used that moment to say, well, what would you want me to do in this situation? So it's listening for those moments. It may be maybe at that lunch you're talking about that they're talking about, oh, do you know what happened to Mary last week?
That's exactly right.
Mary jumped a curb and ran into the front of a store. There's your teachable moment. There's your opening.
And you might think, how does this relate to me as an older adult? But really, if you have somebody who's resistant, or you want to bring up a scenario, use an example of somebody you know. It doesn't have to be, your best friend, but something happened that made you think, and that starts the discussion. So that was a really good idea for you to use.
Right.
The other thing I wanted to mention when we're talking about things to discuss, and we hit on the big ones, which is healthcare and finances, but even small things, what's been coming up lately is what to do with your possessions. A lot of people really maybe don't want to think about it because it's addressing some of their mortality issues. But a lot of people find as their friends are passing, or their sisters or brothers, that the children are really getting upset. And so what they recommend is that you actually sit down with your family, maybe even in child one individually, and say, I just wanted to know which items were important to you. And some people decide already. They say, this is what's going to everybody. Now you know, so that when you're passing and emotions aren't high, that people are not arguing. That's not the legacy I think most people would want to leave.
I had heard that too, and I think that is made so much sense to me when I heard it, is going to each child and saying, here's a list, here's an inventory of the things that I think are important. What do you want? And then collating all of that
Right.
and identifying the things where there may be a conflict
Yeah.
and then working them out. Well, if you get this, then you get,
Right. And it's
how can we work that
twofold.
out? Because your family will trade
Right.
as well and figure out, okay, how important is this? Is this, I think somebody even had them rank them, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Right.
So, yes, I want this, and this one's a
Like
5.
the sticky note game, here's a bunch of sticky notes, this is your number, go around and tag.
Yeah.
I think it's important because one, when things are getting touchy or somebody's sensing that maybe they won't have this thing that they love, they can get a little bit aggressive. So rather than feeling bullied into a decision, if you take the lead and have this discussion, then you really are empowering yourself and educating them versus having somebody saying, well, I really want this chest and this christening dress, even though you've had it forever. Because in one scenario, there was somebody who had a really important family heirloom, and the niece and her daughter just kept bullying her into finally the item was split, and she was just left feeling really upset, and rightfully so.
There's one of those scenarios in conflict resolution where it talks about two people fighting over an orange. I want the orange, I want the orange, and in the end the orange was ripped in half. You've got half, you've got half. And then the story came out that one needed the rind and one needed the pulp. So if they had just talked it through further, both could have had completely what they wanted, and I think that's what we're talking about here.
The other-
And it feels morbid, I think, to people. Oh, and I've heard people say, oh, we don't need to deal with that, just leave it all
Right.
in the house.
But
you're
can I
right.
give an example?
Yeah.
My grandmother recently passed, and she's in another country. I didn't get to spend as much time with her as I would have liked, and I really had no expectations. I really would rather have her spend money on her care. But my father came to visit and brought a necklace, and in India there's a certain kind of necklace that you get when you get married. And the necklace he gave me for my grandmother was her grandmother's.
Wow.
And it was really
That's
meaningful.
special.
And then I thought, if I had known that earlier, I would have been able to hear from her what this meant to her. And as much as I value it now, I imagine I would value even more if she had been alive to tell me the story behind that heirloom.
Right.
And when we talk about these things, I meant to mention that sometimes when you give your children the choice of what they want, you might be surprised. What means something to one person, what means something to you, it could be totally different. So having that conversation is a good one.
What my son took when my grandmother died was an electric donut maker because that was his memory of her, of having homemade cake donuts at her house and putting the sugar on, and that was what he wanted. So it often
Lovely.
isn't what we predict.
Right. Going back to what we were talking about before, when I do talk to a lot of seniors, the other thing that comes up is effective communication and assertiveness. And it's all tied into the role reversal that sometimes takes place. You've been a parent for many years, your children have grown, they have their own children, and as they become parents, something shifts, and maybe they think that they have to parent you, not consciously, but a lot of the older adults feel that way. And I often remind them, you're talking about yourself. You're not talking about them and what their wishes are. And to remind themselves that even though it might be uncomfortable, somebody doesn't want to listen, somebody says, I already know this, or any of those scenarios, that being assertive doesn't mean you're being bossy. It really means you're saying what you want, and then at the end, when something does happen with your house or any of those other issues, you will feel comfortable that you have your wishes being honored.
So if you were to tick them off, what are the things that you would think would list as the important things to have the conversation about? It sounds like one is living arrangement, where you want to live. Understanding also that that may change. I've
Right.
seen a lot of folks who made one decision in their 70s and another decision at 85 when their spouse had passed. And all of a sudden, that plan didn't look like the best plan anymore. So living situation is one.
And you can imagine that if they'd had that conversation ongoing, when they changed their plans, it's understood versus
Right.
resisting the conversation and then saying something and people really not knowing how to support that decision. So aging in place as a former geriatric care manager is definitely my number one because I think that affects so many other issues. The second, a lot of us already know, is finances. I recommend everyone have a power of attorney. I know that's a legal document, and you
and
should
let your
consult
family
a
know
lawyer.
where your records are.
Right, and having a list, and that's scary too. A power of attorney is effective immediately, so you don't want to be turning over all your finances, but it is important. Sometimes it's just that peace of mind. You're not going to pick somebody as your power of attorney that you're really thinking is going to take advantage of you, and if you are, then maybe you need another power of attorney.
One of the thoughts that just came to my mind also is that working with a number of people who have some stage of dementia, for family members to understand that often the first thing that goes is the names, the proper nouns. So if you notice a family member not using people's names, not using place names, not using specific dates, oh yeah, I went over there the other day. But then to begin to look at the finances, because that's often something which is very private, and I think that adult children have a hard time saying, Mom, I need to look at your checkbook, or what do your bills look like? And adults often, the older adults often hold on to, but it's the next thing that often, and then you find out that the insurance bills haven't been paid,
I just
rent
had that
hasn't been
example
paid,
happen to my friend. His grandmother has dementia. The doctors have diagnosed it. She has a power of attorney, but she canceled her long-term care insurance. She said she didn't want to pay it. I don't know who exactly she spoke to, but she filled out a form. But she needs long-term care. They really cannot afford it without that.
Or people are doing all kinds of donations or that kind of thing. So,
I have an example of that also. But you know, I was able to work with the family, and finally her insurance was reinstated. But they didn't even know that had happened.
Right.
I had another woman, a very accomplished artist, worked hard her whole life, and had such severe dementia at such a young age that her children really refused to believe it. And as I got involved, I would call. She'd say, "Hey, how are you?" It was very friendly. But I know that in the end she didn't know who was on the phone, but she didn't want to acknowledge
she was good at
that
covering
either.
it. And especially very social, very intelligent people are really good at covering. And those around them don't really want to acknowledge
And
it.
it got to the point where she was being called and harassed and solicited for donations, to the point where when I started writing to those places asking them to stop, I had to stop around 350 letters.
Wow.
And I know that that wouldn't be what she wanted. I know her children didn't want to hear it. But if they had had the conversation or kind of thought about it, I think that the results could have been different.
Yeah. So living, finances, driving, health, nutrition,
Yes.
all of those are important. You know, make a point of stopping in the kitchen and getting a glass of water and seeing if there's food in the fridge.
Well, water is so
just-
important. It affects your memory, it affects your balance, it affects your health.
But all of those are part of that planning, part of that conversation, part of those signals that you may need. But I think both of us are advocating to not wait until the signals are flashing yellow and red before you have the conversation, to just say, let's talk about it. We know that aging's happening. We all start aging the day we're born. So,
And don't be nervous that by talking about these things that you're showing that you're helpless or that maybe you're going to lose some control. Because I think what we're trying to prove is that as you have these conversations, you're actually showing that you are informed and that you do have control.
that's so important. So, Soni, thank you so much for coming and having this conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
Soni's contact information, as well as the Princeton Senior Resource Center, will be up at the end of the show. And feel free to get in touch with either one of us if
Definitely.
you want some assistance with these kinds of issues or information. And we hope that you find this helpful in having those conversations in your own families or with your own friends. So, thank you.
Thank you.